Hi, everybody. Today we're going to have our lecture on environmental politics. So we're kind of going to divide it into two sections. So first, we're going to look more almost from the economic side and look at why it is that it's so difficult to overcome many environmental challenges. And then we're going to look a little bit at the security side, how environmental change and environmental degradation can potentially lead to conflict. All right, so we're going to start with Adam Smith's legacy. So, Adam Smith argued that individuals acting in their rational self-interest will make decisions that are in the best interest of society. Um, so, kind of the invisible hand idea that if everybody just pursues their own selfish interests, uh, in overall, it'll end up producing the best interest of society. And the question is this correct? And so to help answer this question, I want to divide up different types of goods that we can have in a society. And I want to divide it along two different categories, whether a good is excludable or non-excludable, and whether it's rivalrous or non-rivalrous. So excludable or non-excludable means that can you keep somebody else from consuming it? And then or so can you prevent somebody from consuming it or having access to it? And then rivalrous or non-rivalrous is whether by consuming it or you kind of eliminate So if I eat an apple, that apple's gone. You cannot eat that apple. Where non-rivalrous good, me consuming it doesn't mean that you can't somehow consume it. So if we start with private goods, those are both excludable and rivalrous, right? So private goods are things kind of like anything that many of the products that you would own that you've bought. Again, taking that apple, if I've bought an apple, I can exclude you from eating that apple. And once I've eaten it, it's been consumed, right? So you can't, it's removed one apple from stock, you couldn't have it. Club goods are examples of excludable but non-rivalrous goods. So in this case, you can almost think of any, say, a club membership. Or say TV membership, right? So if you sign up for a cable package. So in both cases of, say, joining a country club or me joining a cable package or signing up for HBO, right? So in both cases, there's some things that you have to pay to have access to. So they are excludable. But me having access, say, to HBO or joining a country club doesn't mean that you can't do so too, right? Unless, for say, the country club has a cap on membership, but let's pretend that it doesn't, or HBO, which wouldn't have a cap on membership. So me signing up for HBO in no ways kind of diminishes the stock and makes it that you can't. Now it does, you still have to pay for access, so it's excludable, but it's not rivalrous. Common goods are ones that are rivalrous but non-excludable. So you can't block people from participating in it, but when everybody who participates kind of uses up some of it. So say in this case, we're talking about say fishing stock in public waters, particularly say international waters. We might be talking about in public land, kind of grass for grazing animals. So we can't, if it's public land, we can't keep people from using it, from say grazing their sheep. But there's a finite stock of grass. Once the sheep has eaten the grass, it's gone. And so it's something that that is rivalrous. And then finally, we have public goods, which are non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So think of things like, say, public roads. Everybody has access to public roads, and just because I use a public road doesn't mean that you're less able to. It may make more traffic, but I haven't consumed the road. I haven't destroyed it by kind of using it. So let's look at public versus private goods and the difference. So let's consider a situation with a factory and a house that are neighbors, right? So there's a house right beside a factory. The factory produces soot that lands on the house, and so this is a negative externality from the factory. So this is kind of like a negative product that is produced. So some form of pollution is produced, and it lands on the house. So it causes a cost. So this factory produces a negative cost for the house. If the cost to the factory of adjusting to cleaner methods exceed the cost imposed on the house by the soot, then no bargain is possible. There's no way that the house and the factory can reach some sort of agreement. So say it costs the factory $1,000 to put in place, say, new filters. But the cost of the soot on the house is only 500, right? Then there's no real bargain that can be struck because the house might offer, say, $500 to the factory to change the filters. The factory sees that the cost of changing is 1,000. They're not willing. They have no reason why they necessarily want to pay that extra 500, and so there's no real bargain that can be struck between these two to solve it. If the cost to the factory of adjusting are less than the cost imposed on the house, then a bargain is possible. So let's imagine that it still costs 1,000 to adjust, but it's imposing $2,000 in costs on the house, right? So that house could offer anything between 0 and 2,000 to the factory to change its cleaning system or its output system. The factory would be willing to accept anything between 1,000 and 2,000 because it costs 1,000. So anything at 1,000 is a break even, and anything above 1,000 is actually making the money. So there's a range of bargains, anything really between 1,000 and 2,000 that the house and the neighbors could strike. And this, therefore, would be kind of the proper operation. Everybody acting in their self-interest could produce, the best scenario for different people. In this case, in the case of where the costs for the house were higher than the cost of adjusting, then you could solve a bargain that makes everybody better off. So the private sector or just private action could work. But now let's consider a situation with a factory that's close proximity to several houses. So the factory produces soot that lands on all of the houses. And so this is a negative externally from the factory that affects not just one house, but multiple houses. So if the cost of the factory of adjusting to cleaner methods exceed the cost imposed on the houses by the soot, then no bargain is possible. And this is the same before, right? If the cost to all the houses combined is still that 500 and the cost of adjusting is 1,000, then those houses combined wouldn't be offering enough to the factory to make a change. If the cost to the factory of adjusting are less than the cost imposed on the house, then a bargain is possible. So this is the exact same as before. Say the total cost to the different houses is 2,000, the cost to the factory are still 1,000. There's a bargain that could be struck. But here's where the problem starts coming in. In the public goods case, so in this case, because there's multiple houses, it becomes a public good, right? So it's costs on multiple different houses. So it's just essentially environmental, air kind of quality in the area. There's an incentive to free ride. So if one house or group of houses pays the cost, the free riding house enjoys the benefit of the factory no longer producing soot, but don't pay the cost of adjustment. So say there's 20 houses, and so they would be dividing. Ideally, they'd be dividing up the cost equally. But one of the houses decides, well, these other houses really, really, really don't like this, so they're going to be paying anyways. So why don't I say I don't have the money to do so? I still get the benefit, right? Because they're not going to tell the factory, okay, you can only change to a clean system, but you just target that one house because they didn't pay. That's not the way that changing the filters will change. Either the factory puts in place the filters, or they don't put in place the filters. So if the other houses care enough and are going to pay, one house could say, well, I can't afford to do it, so you guys do it. And another house could say the same, and another house could say the same, and another house could say the same. So there's an incentive to try to get others to pay, because if you don't pay and others pay, you still get the benefit. And so at the end, because so many people see the free riding, everybody kind of wants everybody else to pay the cost, and they prefer to avoid paying the cost. And so you could potentially see already the parallels to a lot of what we're dealing with climate change, right? Everybody recognizes the problem, right? That there's overpollution, and that it's going to impose costs on everyone. Because climate change can damage all different societies across the world. It's really a global problem. But what we also see is that, particularly for smaller states, but all states really take this approach. What we prefer to have happen is, so like what we need is everybody to act. But if everybody minus one country acts, we're still going to have a net improvement in the situation, and everybody's going to benefit from that improvement. So the one who cheats and continues polluting is still going to see an improvement in the overall situation, because all other countries would have taken action on climate change, and so they'll see the benefit, but aren't going to have paid any of the costs. But because everybody looks at it the same way, right? Everybody really wants everybody else. When we see negotiations on it, what we really end up seeing in practice is everybody wants everybody else to cut emissions. Well, they say they want to. When they look at the costs, they'd like to avoid the costs. So we end up seeing a lot of free riding, that people make agreements on it, but then they are really hoping that everyone else is going to pay the costs. They'll still benefit from the actions taken by the other, and they save themselves the economic hardship. So if we don't have to, if Canada doesn't have to bother putting in place the cost of changes, but we still get a really big improvement in climate, that from the Canadian perspective would almost be a win-win. But if every country adopts that same view, then nobody ends up doing anything. Now I want to turn, so there we're looking at the difference between public and private. And in that case, we saw that when we're dealing with public goods, you'll often have the case that, so with private goods, you can often solve bargaining problems and get to the society's kind of what's best for society's self-interest. So Adam Smith in the private sector, at least theoretically, might be right. But when we're dealing with private goods, might be right. But when we're dealing with public goods, because of the free riding problem, even if it is in people's kind of rational self-interest, they end up underproviding it. So let's look at the tragedy of the commons. So here's a situation where 50 Hertz people share a field. So it's a common. The field has enough grass for 1,000 sheep, and each sheep is worth +1. So how many sheep should each herds person keep? So think about it for a second. Maybe do a little bit of math. All right, so let's take a look. So maximum capacity is 20 sheep per herds person, right? So we had 50 herds people, and maximum capacity was 4,000. So that would leave 20 sheep per herds person if each herds person got the same amount. And then 20 sheep per herds person equals a value of +20 each. Now, and so that would kind of be the equitable division. But herds people then can start thinking about additional things. So for example, if a herds person adds 1 sheep, they then gain the benefit of the additional sheep, so they gain the +1. But the cost of overgrazing, -1, are shared among the 50 herds people. So benefit of an additional sheep is 1, so the plus 1, minus 0.02, because that's minus 1 divided by 20 people, so is equal to 0.98. So yes, it's not as much as what they would have had adding the sheep, each sheep before, but it's actually pretty close to it. So as long as the benefit of additional sheep is above cost, then it's rational to increase the size of the herd. But the problem becomes that it's not just one herdsperson that's looking at that. It's all the different herds people are looking at. If I added a sheep, I get the full benefit of it, but the costs are spread across all the different herds people. And we see that a lot with, not just sheep, but fishing or pollution, stuff like that, where we see that the benefits of, say, polluting more, of putting in a little bit of air pollution, right? The benefit, if my factory puts a little bit more air pollution, the benefit goes all to me, but the costs are spread across many, many different people. So from my individual perspective, it seems still reasonable to continue polluting. So the result is that defection is common. So here we have, and so the situation ends up resembling something like prisoner's dilemma, where we've got cooperating is respecting the limits. But what we prefer to cooperate and respecting limits is that you defect while others still cooperate, right? So you add, everybody else sticks to their 20, you add more, you get the benefit, and you share the cost with others. So you come out net ahead, you come out above 20, and all the others come down less than 20 because they get some of the cost for each sheep that you add. And because everybody has the same incentive, where we end up kind of the equilibrium position, like in prisoner's dilemma, is that everybody ends up defecting. Everybody ends up kind of adding more, taking more than their share, because they get the full benefit of it and they share the cost. And because everybody has the same, while we prefer to respect limits, because respecting limits is actually better than this, because of the fear of others defecting, defecting is always the better option. So what are different solutions? So Garrett Hardin was one of the first was the first to kind of introduce the tragedy of the common scenario. So a couple of possible solutions that we have. So first is privatization. So you could essentially privatize the common. So if you made the field become privately owned, right? And say everybody had to pay access, or you had like a government that, or private agency that controls it. And so each person is given a certain number of slots and they can't exceed it. So rather than trusting people to do it, there's kind of an enforcement through being privatized. So it might be that you have to pay a certain amount of money to let your sheep graze there, and whoever owns it, right, has an incentive in having the field not degrade because they own it. And so what they're going to be doing, because if it's privately owned, the benefits of additional sheep go to the owner, but also the full costs. So if each additional sheep above kind of what the field can give, they get the full +1, but they also get the full -1, then there's no benefit to adding additional sheep and potentially risking degrading their land and costing them in the long term. So through privatization, we change kind of the calculation. So that's in smaller scale things like a field, that could be a viable solution. In some of the other areas, privatization, we can't privatize, the oceans, fish stocks, or we can't privatize, the air. Other is coercion. So usually, often, say, through the form of taxation. So you tax people for usage, and it could be that, and so the taxes will make them want to stick to a certain limit. It could be that taxes increase above a certain amount. So if you go above your quota, you get taxed. So if you go above your 20 sheep, you'd face a tax that would make it so that the costs outweigh the gains. So say, so each additional sheep you're getting plus 0.98. Say you had to pay a tax of 1 if you exceed your 20 sheep. Well, then now you'd be taking a loss for exceeding it. In the case of, say, something like air pollution, if you put in a tax on carbon emissions, which is what some governments have looked at and implemented, then it's putting a cost into putting in air pollution. So rather than before, the company was getting all the benefits of polluting and spreading the cost across all different people, but now they're getting an additional cost for doing so. And so hopefully it'll incentivize development of different technologies, because while before it may have been beneficial to pollute, now it's less beneficial. So how do try to shape the commons and the environment? So how does this relate to different environmental areas? So we could see in terms of fishing and hunting. So overfishing or overhunting, thinking of, say, the ocean as a global commons or hunting as kind of public commons. If you overfish, right? If everybody, if the oceans can only sustain a certain amount of fishing, but one country, like, well, if I overfish, I get all the benefits and the costs are spread across. Same thing with hunting, air pollution and water pollution. So the benefits of polluting, so often through industry or agriculture or whatever it might be, go fully to the polluter, but the costs are spread across multiple people. And then even population, right? In terms of you gain the full benefits of having children, but the costs of overpopulation are spread across society. So how do different theories relate to this? So the realism one's a little bit of a simplification, but particularly earlier, not entirely inaccurate. So realism, what's the environment? So more or less, particularly earlier when the environment started raising as an issue, and still to a certain extent, realism would not have put the environment as a primary concern. As when we're starting to talk about the security side, and as the environment can lead to conflict, this will start to change, possibly, because it starts to be the source of military conflict. And to the extent that realism would look at tragedy of commons, they would look at the exercise of power in solving it, right? So different states have different power, and so who gets to cheat to a certain extent will depend on their power. Neoliberal institutionalism will looking at the use of international governmental organizations or different organizations to increase transparency, provide enforcement, and create issue linkages, right? So many of these problems are related to lack of information about what others are doing, so you don't necessarily know that others are cheating. Enforcement, if you're able to punish others for cheating, then you disincentivize the cheating. And provide issue linkages to make it easier to make deals. So tie more than one issue together, say one where you have an advantage to one where you have a disadvantage. And so an agreement is reachable. And then constructivism will look at changes of culture and norms to help solve it, right? So not only do we need agreements, but we also just need kind of a change in how we approach the world, right? One where we, as humans can exploit and do whatever we want, to ones where we're maybe more supposed to be stewards of the world or supposed to manage it, and just kind of a change of how we look at the economy to, say, a cultural change of sustainable development away from just development, change of what is appropriate behavior, say change in norms, say related to recycling or what products are to be used, and stuff like that. All right, so now let's turn to environmental security. So climate change and environmental change can lead to conflict through migration, conflict over resources. So, some of the important ones being water, oil, and food, poverty, and etc. Climate change and environmental change can also lead to direct threats to state security. So in this case, we can have indirect conflict. It's not that environmental change directly produces conflict, but it indirectly does it through things like migration, conflict over resources, poverty, say, leading to grievances. But it also can have direct threats to state security. So things, involving, catastrophic storms, drought, stuff like that, natural disasters that just directly aren't military threats to state security, but can do massive damages to a state. The pursuit of state security can damage the environment. So looking at this is kind of flipping the arrow. These ones are looking at how climate change and environmental change can lead to threats to state security. This is looking at how pursuit of state security can damage the environment. So wars are actually very destructive to the environment, not only in terms of, say, bombs just blowing up the environment, but also a lot of military hardware. So tanks aren't particularly fuel efficient. So in wars, massive amounts of oil are burned through. So you have very environmentally unfriendly equipment. You have explosions and chemicals being released into the environment and stuff like that. So there was kind of a movement when we started realizing that the environment was related to security, that we need to reconceptualize our definition of security, right? So it used to be that when we talk security, we were purely talking military. But because the environment can be related to security of the state, then there's an argument that we need to reconceptualize in the 1990s our definition of security to include things like environmental security. Around the same time, there was a movement towards human security, that we shouldn't just be focused on state security, we should also be looking at security of humans within the state. So in the 1990s, there was a push towards kind of expanding our definition of security away from just kind of state military security. So one of the projects looking at that was a massive project of Thomas Homer Dixon that's been ongoing for a long time, kind of a series of projects where he wanted to kind of unpack some of the kind of conflict, how environmental change could be related to conflict. So the premise is, with population growth and increased development, renewable resource scarcity will increase. So it's kind of the background population. So we've got growing population and increased development. So each person is using more resources, and we've got larger population. So inevitably, eventually, we have many of our resources are renewable. So there's a limit to how much we have. So renewable resource scarcity will increase. That's just based on the dual facts of population growth and increased development. So they led them to ask questions: does environmental scarcity cause violent conflict? And if so, how does it operate? So what are the types of environmental change that we see that can potentially produce conflict? So there's greenhouse gas induced climate change, there's stratospheric ozone depletion, degradation and loss of good agricultural land, degradation and removal of forests, depletion and pollution of freshwater supplies, and depletion of fisheries. So these are all different environmental changes that we're seeing. And the question is, can do some of these, all of these, some of these in combination lead to, help lead to scarcity and to conflict. So here's some competing hypotheses, or different hypotheses that we have about how scarcity can lead to conflict. So the first is called the simple scarcity hypothesis, and it argues that decreasing supplies of physically controllable environmental resources, such as clean water and good agricultural land, would provoke interstate simple scarcity conflict or resource wars. So as different countries start running low on necessary resources, from agricultural land to water to uh, oil, you'll start seeing wars that the reason behind the war is conflict over these access to them. So say there's a river that is between two different countries that's shared by two different countries, and water starts becoming a problem. You may have a war over who has control. It used to be a shared river. Now one country wants to control it completely. Um, you might have wars over if there's a border region that controls or that has oil, right? You might have wars over who controls those oil resources. So that's a simple scarcity. So this is kind of more of a direct um, link between scarcity and resources and conflict. Second is a group identity hypothesis. So essentially, large population movements caused by environmental stress would induce group identity conflicts, especially ethnic clashes. So essentially, this is based on the idea that with environmental change, some areas or some regions will begin running out of resources, and so populations are going to have to move. And certainly, you're seeing increase, say, urbanization, as there's less opportunities rural, but you're also going to see different groups moving into new, even rural regions, trying to kind of develop, say, agriculture uh, or whatever business in those areas. So they'll move into new areas. And so what you can have is groups that used to be separate are now trying to occupy the same land. And they're groups that are already experiencing stress. They've already had to leave their home, and now they're coming in contact with groups. There's conflict over who controls the resources in that region. And so you could start just having kind of group identity conflicts, especially ethnic clashes, because you have groups that used to be separate and are now occupying the same space. And then finally, we've got a deprivation hypothesis. So severe environmental scarcity would simultaneously increase economic deprivation and disrupt key social institutions, which in turn would cause deprivation conflicts such as civil strife and insurgency. So when you have scarcity, you'll have at the same time economic deprivation. So particularly, or certain segments of the population will not have enough. And because of the scarcity, you're also going to have weakened social institutions. Um, and this will combine to produce kind of deprivation conflicts, such as civil strife and insurgency. So particularly those who are kind of have-nots in the society, who are experiencing the economic deprivation, are going to have conflict with those, or could begin conflicts or insurgency against those who are controlling the resources. So what are some of the findings? So on resource deprivation and degradation, of the major environmental changes facing humankind, degradation and depletion of agricultural land, forests, water, and fish will contribute more to social turmoil in coming decades than will climate change or ozone depletion. Well, on ozone depletion, that's something that we've been reversing a lot. So that shouldn't be leading too much to conflict. But the idea here is that climate change, now this was written quite a while ago, in the 1990s. So and the idea then was that the negative effects of climate change were still decades away, where the negative effects of degradation and depletion of these different resources was much sooner. So climate change could be devastating, but its effects were going to be longer away. Now, this was, again, it was written in, I believe, 1994. So we're 6 years since then. So whether climate change now will start playing a larger role, as well as we're starting to see more and more negative effects that are related to climate change in terms of storm intensity and frequency, or major storm intensity and frequency. That's possible, but it's not only climate change. That's something that we talk about a lot, but when we're looking at conflict, still degradation, depletion of these different resources right? It's just going to continue and continue and continue to get worse, particularly as climate change starts kicking in too. Things like agricultural land and availability is, going to be more difficult, or is going to be more stressed as climate continues changing. You have less, as drought spreads, there's less and less available agricultural land. So, these are tied together. As you get more and more drought, you're also going to have, less and less available water as there's less rainfall in certain regions. Vast populations in the developing world are already suffering from shortages of good land, water, forests, and fish. In contrast, yes, the social effects of climate change will probably not be seen until well into the next century. Unfortunately, we're 1/5 of the way through the next century, so some of those are going to start kicking in. Again, other than ozone depletion, something that we really seem to have turned the corner on. But the shortage of land, water, forests, and fish is something that in certain regions of the world we've already been experiencing for decades, and so it's already been putting strain on different communities. So environmental scarcity. So environmental change is only one of the 3 sources of scarcity of renewable resources. The others are population growth and unequal social distribution of resources. So when we talk about environmental scarcity, we're really talking about the combination of environmental change, so the degradation of different resources like agricultural land or disappearance of things like agricultural land, combined with population growth and unequal social distribution of resources. And so kind of the way that they fit together is think of it in terms of a resource pie. Reduction in the quantity or quality of resource shrinks the resource pie. So as agricultural land either degrades or kind of disappears, then we see a shrinking of the resource pie. So the pie, is shrinking in total size. So there's less resources to be shared among everyone. Population growth divides the pie into smaller and smaller slices. So not only are we dealing with a smaller pie overall, but because of population growth, everybody gets a smaller and smaller slice of a smaller and smaller pie. And unequal resource distribution means that some groups get disproportionately large slices. So as income inequality, wealth inequality, and resource inequality continues to grow, not only do you have a smaller and smaller pie that's shared by more and more people, but some people have a disproportionate access to that pie. So, and a growing access almost to it. So particularly the most disadvantaged are dealing with a smaller pie, smaller and smaller slices, and they're sharing, even their slices are getting squeezed by unequal distributions. And so these 3 together lead to what's called environmental scarcity. And the environmental scarcity, these 3 things operating together can help produce conflict. So how do these interaction sources of environmental scarcity, how do they interact? So one way would be through resource capture. So a fall in the quality and quantity of renewable resources combined with population growth to encourage powerful groups within a society to shift resource distribution in their favor. This can produce dire environmental scarcity for poorer and weaker groups. Claims to resources are opposed by those powerful elites. So that's kind of what we talked about with as the pie continues shrinking, and there's more and more kind of mouths to feed, and more people. It encourages, when seeing that, it encourages those with kind of the most power that they can grab up a bunch of the resources they want. To give them incentive to shift the resource distribution in their favor. So essentially, they take control of that resource, to capture that resource, so to take control of agricultural land, or take control of waterways or fisheries, of oil resources, to capture that resource so that that powerful group gets a disproportionate amount of the benefits, and the weaker groups get a smaller and smaller amount. And this can eventually produce extreme hardship on those groups. And this can lead to ecological marginalization. So unequal resource access can combine with population growth to cause migrations to regions that are ecologically fragile, such as steep upland slopes, areas at risk of desertification, and tropical rainforests. High population densities in these areas, combined with a lack of knowledge and capital to protect local resources cause severe environmental damage and chronic poverty. So if you have unequal resource access where you used to live, and if you're in one of those weaker groups, and because of resource capture or just because of severe degradation, you don't have enough. And combined with the fact of population growth, so there's less and less available where you were. It's being shared by more and more people. It's going to push many people to start migrating to regions that people didn't previously live, because the area wasn't ecologically sound for say what you'd want to be doing. So you might start trying to do agriculture on steep upland slopes, on big slopes, or in areas of risk of desertification, areas where normally in ideal scenarios you wouldn't want to say be doing agriculture, because it's not really suitable, or it's at high risk. It may be suitable in some years, but also have years that are high probability of really, really bad years. So it's great in those good years, but in some other years you may not produce nearly enough. And because we've seen the most kind of marginalized or the weakest groups often being the ones who have to move into these new areas, they often don't have, say, the educational background to be able to know how to manage agriculture, for example, in these more difficult regions, and the capital to get the equipment to be able to do so, so that they can do so in a way that protects the local resources and doesn't degrade them. You can end up kind of in this vicious cycle of end up quickly degrading the resources in that area, damaging the resources in those areas, so that they have to keep moving on to different ones, and are stuck in a vicious cycle of poverty. So how do all of these work together? So we've got our three sources of environmental scarcity. So decreasing quality and quantity of renewable resources combined with population growth, combined with unequal resource access, lead to increased environmental scarcity. Now, increased environmental scarcity both leads to decreased economic productivity and directly to migrant expulsion. Now, increased environmental scarcity also indirectly leads to migrant expulsion through decreased economic productivity. So increased environmental scarcity will lead some to lead directly, but it's also going to lead to decreased economic output. And because decreased economic output, it's going to lead to migrant expulsion. Both of these lead to a weakened state. Migrant expulsion also leads to ethnic conflict. Decreased economic productivity can also lead to deprivation conflicts and a weakened state. And both of these can indirectly lead to all three, to ethnic conflict, coup d'etat, and deprivation conflicts through weakened states. So migrant expulsion is directly linked to ethnic conflict. Decreased economic productivity is directly linked to deprivation conflict. Both are directly linked to weakened states, and both are directly linked to ethnic conflict, coup d'etats, and deprivation conflicts. So this is kind of taking how different parts of environmental scarcity and your environmental change in this particular one can have different social effects, and these social effects can lead to conflict. So it's kind of the story based on the findings of how environmental scarcity can lead to conflict. So the answers to the question that Homer Dixon at the beginning were asking seemed to be, does scarcity lead to, or environmental change, does it lead to conflict? The answer seems to be yes, based on his findings. And the second question was how, and this is kind of the mechanism. This is kind of how it operates. All right, so that's it on the environmental politics lecture. Have a great day.